For centuries, the battleship represented the undisputed pinnacle of naval power, a floating fortress of steel and colossal guns. German naval doctrine, like many others in the 1930s, remained deeply entrenched in the grandeur and perceived invincibility of the capital ship. The very idea of a vulnerable vessel designed primarily to launch and recover aircraft seemed almost a laughable distraction to the conservative minds of the Kriegsmarine's Admiralty. They believed that the decisive naval engagement would always be won by the heaviest armor and the longest-reaching, largest-caliber naval artillery. This commitment to the battleship was not merely a matter of tradition. It was a deeply ingrained strategic belief that dictated shipbuilding programs and fleet planning. The massive, heavily armed ships like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz were viewed as the ultimate expression of Germany's naval ambition and capability. Their entire strategy for commerce raiding and challenging the Royal Navy in the North Atlantic centered on these heavily protected, swift-moving behemoths. Aircraft carriers were often dismissed as merely expensive, lightly armored targets, essentially floating bomb platforms too fragile for the rigors of modern naval combat. They argued that a carrier could be easily disabled by a single lucky hit, rendering its entire air wing useless and wasting immense resources in its construction. Furthermore, German naval thinkers considered the long distances and rough conditions of the Atlantic environment to be inherently hostile to the delicate nature of naval aviation operations. The operational focus was on U-boats and heavy surface raiders, tools perfectly suited, they thought, for their asymmetric warfare against the British blockade. This deeply held skepticism about air power at sea meant that the German Navy remained fatally slow to adapt to the revolutionary changes sweeping through global naval warfare. Their focus remained fixed on the past, prioritizing traditional metrics of firepower and protection over the emerging, flexible power of the carrier strike group. This rigid adherence to a centuries-old philosophy would soon be exposed as a devastating and nearly fatal strategic miscalculation by a single, shocking night in a secluded Italian harbor. The stage was set for a dramatic demonstration of air power supremacy that would irrevocably alter the course of the naval war and prove the German admirals disastrously wrong. They simply could not yet conceive of a time when the biggest guns on the sea would not belong to a battleship, but rather to the torpedoes and bombs delivered by a simple biplane. The cost of this technological and doctrinal blindness would ultimately be measured in lost ships, missed opportunities, and a permanent handicap for the German surface fleet in World War II. Germany's attempt to build an aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, perfectly encapsulates the Kriegsmarine's internal strategic conflict and ultimate failure of vision. The construction of the carrier began in 1936, a tentative acknowledgement of the emerging international trend toward naval air power. However, the project was plagued from its inception by a constant lack of enthusiasm and persistent bureaucratic infighting among the highest levels of the German Navy. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, held a fundamental and deep-seated disdain for the new weapon, prioritizing the construction of battleships instead. He viewed the carrier as a deviation from the main focus of his fleet, a costly experiment that diverted essential resources from the proven battleship program. The necessary specialized aircraft and trained air crews were continually delayed or inadequately provided, reflecting the low priority the entire project held. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, further complicated matters by refusing to cede control over the development and training of naval air units. This inter-service rivalry created an insurmountable logistical and doctrinal hurdle that prevented the carrier from ever becoming a viable, operational component of the German fleet. Work on the Graf Zeppelin was repeatedly halted and restarted, reflecting the wavering commitment and fundamental lack of conviction at the top of the naval command structure. By 1939, when the hull was launched, it was already clear that the carrier was an afterthought, not a central pillar of the German naval strategy. The ship remained incomplete throughout the war, a physical manifestation of the German admirals' inability to fully embrace the future of naval warfare. This hesitation was rooted in a practical dismissal of carrier vulnerability, a belief that its large size and thin armor made it an unacceptable risk in battle. They saw the carrier as dependent on perfect weather and air superiority, a condition they believed was unattainable in the brutal North Atlantic theater of operations. In contrast, they lauded the battleship's capacity to absorb punishment and continue fighting, a tangible and well-understood metric of naval strength. The admirals preferred the tangible power of big guns to the abstract and uncertain reach of aviation, a cognitive bias that proved fatal to their ambitions. This internal rejection of the carrier concept meant that Germany entered the war without a single operational naval air arm capable of challenging the dominant power of the Royal Navy. It was a failure not just of engineering and construction, but a profound and costly failure of strategic imagination and foresight. The world was already moving beyond the era of the battleship, but the German admirals were content to keep their eyes fixed on the legacy of the old Imperial Navy. While the Kriegsmarine hesitated and stalled, the Royal Navy, Britain's senior service, was quietly but resolutely embracing the aircraft carrier's potential. The British were among the pioneers of naval aviation, having experimented with sea-launched aircraft since the earliest days of World War I. Crucially, the Royal Navy viewed the carrier not as a vulnerable add-on, but as a crucial, offensive weapon capable of projecting power far beyond the range of any battleship gun. By 1940, despite having a smaller number of carriers than they desired, they possessed the operational experience and doctrinal maturity that Germany completely lacked. The Admiralty understood that naval air power could neutralize the threat of enemy surface fleets even within the confines of their supposedly safe home harbors. This strategic concept was a radical departure from the traditional line of battle thinking that still dominated many other navies around the world. The Fleet Air Arm, the air component of the Royal Navy, was continuously refining its tactics, particularly in the challenging art of the nighttime torpedo attack. Their aircraft of choice for this particular operation was the Fairey Swordfish, an antiquated-looking biplane that was nevertheless rugged, reliable, and perfectly suited for low-speed, accurate torpedo drops. The slow speed of the biplane, a perceived weakness, was ironically a significant advantage in a night attack, allowing the pilots to line up their shots with precision. Its construction also made it a stable platform for torpedo delivery and difficult for modern anti-aircraft gunners to track effectively at night. The British training emphasized surprise, coordination, and a willingness to accept high risk for a potentially decisive strategic gain. This focused innovation was driven by the necessity of challenging the superior numbers of the Italian fleet, the Regia Marina, in the critical Mediterranean theater. The Italian fleet, though powerful and modern, was effectively tying down vast resources of the Royal Navy that were desperately needed elsewhere. A direct, conventional naval engagement was too risky, forcing the British to seek a revolutionary, asymmetric solution to the problem. The aircraft carrier, and the torpedo bomber it carried, was the chosen instrument to break the strategic deadlock and project British power into a heavily contested zone. This quiet, yet profound, shift in operational thinking laid the essential groundwork for one of the most strategically significant and shocking naval victories of the entire war. The British were prepared to bet on technology and surprise, while their German counterparts still placed their faith in the sheer weight of armor and steel. Taranto was not just a naval base, it was the formidable home port for the vast majority of the powerful Italian battle fleet, situated deep within the Mediterranean. The harbor was considered one of the most secure anchorages in the world, a strategic jewel that represented Italy's dominance in its home waters. Its defenses were multi-layered and robust, including heavy anti-aircraft batteries ringing the harbor and extensive anti-torpedo netting protecting the most valuable assets. The anchorage was relatively shallow, which the Italian admirals believed provided an additional, natural defense against the threat of naval torpedoes. They assumed, quite reasonably, that any air-launched torpedo would dive too deeply into the mud and detonate harmlessly before reaching the ship's hull. This natural and artificial protection led to a significant degree of complacency within the Regia Marina regarding the possibility of a successful air attack. The presence of the Italian fleet at Taranto effectively blocked critical Allied supply routes and projected a constant threat against British lines of communication to Egypt and Malta. To the British, neutralizing this fleet was paramount, a required first step to regain control of the essential Mediterranean lifeline. The target set within the harbor was spectacularly rich, including several modern and recently refitted Italian battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The concentration of such immense naval power in a single, well-defined, and relatively small space presented a unique and tempting opportunity for a decisive, surgical strike. Intelligence gathered over months had confirmed the precise positions of the capital ships, allowing the British planners to meticulously plot every detail of the coming operation. The sheer audacity of attacking a heavily defended harbor at night, using outdated biplanes, was a testament to the desperate and innovative nature of the British approach. The name of the British operation was Judgment, a fitting moniker for a raid designed to deliver a powerful and unexpected verdict on the supremacy of the battleship era. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, dependent on perfect execution, maximum surprise, and a successful overcoming of the harbor's layered defenses and the Italians' own hubris. The Italian fleet was anchored, resting on its laurels, confident that the combination of shallow water and massive fortifications rendered them practically untouchable by aerial attack. They were about to learn a brutal and permanent lesson about the changing nature of naval warfare and the deadly, unforgiving reach of a carrier-borne strike force. On the night of November 11, 1940, the attack force of 21 ferry Swordfish took off from the deck of the British aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious. The flight was divided into two distinct waves, designed to maximize the shock and confusion within the heavily populated Italian harbor. They flew in darkness, guided only by the faint light of a half-moon and the critical intelligence gathered on the enemy fleet's disposition. Each plane carried either a torpedo, specially modified with a wooden nose to run in the shallow waters, or high-explosive bombs and flares for illumination. The first wave, arriving around 11:35 p.m., began its approach, with the flare-carrying aircraft dropping their payloads to light up the harbor with an eerie, perfect glow. The sudden illumination caught the Italian defenders completely by surprise, turning the battleship anchorage into a brightly lit, vulnerable target zone. Anti-aircraft fire immediately erupted from the shore batteries and the ships themselves, a chaotic storm of tracer rounds and exploding shells streaking across the night sky. Despite the intense opposition, the slow-moving Swordfish, their engines barely audible, pressed home their attacks with unwavering, deadly determination. The pilots were trained to fly a precise, low-level profile, maneuvering between the anti-torpedo nets and the anchored vessels to ensure a direct hit. The second wave of aircraft arrived shortly after the first, maintaining the pressure and preventing the Italian defenders from regaining any semblance of coordinated defense. The sound of explosions soon began to mingle with the noise of the biplanes and the frantic chatter of the Italian radio communications. The specially modified torpedoes performed exactly as the British planners had hoped, running true and straight despite the shallow depth of the inner harbour. One of the first major successes was a devastating torpedo strike against the battleship Conte di Cava, which immediately began to list heavily. The coordinated attack was a masterclass in naval air strategy, proving that small, determined forces could achieve disproportionate strategic results. The entire engagement lasted for a matter of hours, a brief, violent demonstration of the carrier's power to project overwhelming force with pinpoint accuracy. The venerable, obsolete-looking biplanes achieved what no conventional naval force could have hoped to accomplish without suffering catastrophic losses in a direct engagement. The aftermath of the British strike at Taranto harbour was one of unmitigated disaster and profound shock for the Italian Naval Command. When the sun rose on November 12, the full extent of the devastating aerial assault became shockingly clear to the bewildered base personnel. The powerful Italian battle fleet, their supposed shield of the Mediterranean, lay crippled, listing, and burning in the previously secure anchorage. 3 mighty Italian battleships, Conte di Cava, Duilio, and the brand-new Littorio, had been effectively knocked out of action by the precise torpedo strikes. The Conte di Cava was so badly damaged that she sank in the shallow water and would never return to active service for the remainder of the war. The Duilio and Littorio were also critically damaged and would require months of extensive, high-priority repairs, removing them from the strategic theatre at a vital time. In stark contrast, the attacking force suffered remarkably light losses, with only 2 of the 21 vulnerable Swordfish biplanes being shot down during the raid. The disproportionate nature of the losses immediately highlighted the fundamental shift in the balance of naval power that had just occurred. The tactical victory was absolute, a perfect demonstration of the offensive reach and strategic value of the aircraft carrier. The material damage was compounded by the psychological blow dealt to the Italian admirals, who suddenly found their most powerful assets completely vulnerable in their home port. They were forced to acknowledge that the traditional defenses they had relied upon, heavy netting and shallow water, were no longer sufficient to guarantee safety. The remaining operational battleships were quickly, and rather ignominiously, withdrawn from Taranto and redeployed to safer northern ports for their protection. This sudden, forced withdrawal immediately handed the initiative to the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, opening up crucial sea lanes and reducing the threat to Allied convoys. The strategic consequences of the raid were far-reaching and immediate, altering the entire naval balance of power in the region overnight. The shockwaves of the attack reverberated across the world's navies, proving a clear and undeniable case for the aircraft carrier's role as the new king of the sea. News of the Taranto raid reached the high command of the German Kriegsmarine with an unmistakable, electrifying jolt of bewildered surprise. For years, the German admirals had comfortably dismissed the aircraft carrier as a costly, fragile, and ultimately ineffectual weapon system for serious naval combat. Their long-standing, unwavering belief in the supremacy of the battleship had just been dramatically and violently refuted by a handful of slow-moving British biplanes. Admiral Raeder and his contemporaries were reportedly stunned by the sheer audacity and the devastating effectiveness of the perfectly executed aerial torpedo attack. The fact that an entire battle fleet could be crippled in its own supposedly secure harbor without any engagement from enemy surface ships was a profound and disturbing revelation. The attack forced a period of immediate and uncomfortable introspection within the German naval planning staff, challenging their most basic and cherished doctrinal assumptions. Detailed reports on the operation were meticulously analyzed and dissected by German naval intelligence officers, desperate to understand the nature of the British success. They studied the effectiveness of the shallow-running torpedoes and the vulnerabilities of anchored ships to a coordinated, low-level, nocturnal air strike. The Taranto raid served as an irrefutable, real-world case study, demonstrating the carrier's capacity to achieve strategic paralysis with minimal material cost. This new evidence could no longer be ignored, forcing a reluctant but necessary re-evaluation of the stalled Graf Zeppelin project and the role of naval aviation in general. The previous arguments against the carrier, its vulnerability, its cost, its operational complexity, suddenly seemed hollow in the face of such overwhelming strategic success. It was now undeniably clear that the future of naval warfare belonged to those who could control the airspace above the sea, not merely the surface of the water itself. However, the German naval bureaucracy, deeply conservative and already resource-constrained, struggled to translate this intellectual shock into immediate, decisive action. While the necessity of naval air power was now recognized at the highest levels, the resources and political will were already too heavily committed to the battleship and U-boat programs. The internal struggles with the Luftwaffe over air control continued, acting as a profound impediment to any rapid, necessary adaptation of naval doctrine. The lesson of Taranto was learned, but it was learned too late, a bitter truth that would forever hobble the Kriegsmarine's ability to challenge the Allied control of the oceans. The single night of the Taranto raid achieved an instantaneous, global upending of centuries of traditional naval doctrine. The core belief that a navy's strength was measured by the combined weight of its battleship broadsides was rendered obsolete in a flash of torpedo explosions. The event unequivocally demonstrated that naval power was now a function of range and speed of delivery, with the aircraft carrier as the new, dominant metric. Before Taranto, admirals around the world envisioned the naval battle of the future as a clash of steel behemoths meeting on the open sea, firing shells at long range. After Taranto, the terrifying realization set in that a powerful, expensive battle fleet could be neutralized before its guns even had a chance to bear on the enemy. The new reality was a three-dimensional battlefield where the attack could come from the air, striking at the most vulnerable parts of the ship's structure. The torpedo bomber, a relatively cheap and easily produced weapon platform, proved its decisive superiority over the multi-million-dollar armored capital ship. It created a profound strategic and psychological shift, essentially relegating the once mighty battleship to the role of a massive, heavily armed escort vessel. The great naval powers of the world, particularly the United States and Japan, immediately took notice and began to accelerate their own carrier construction and training programs. The Japanese Naval Command, in particular, meticulously studied the Taranto operation, viewing it as a blueprint for a similar, future surprise attack. They realized that the British success hinged on meticulous planning, nighttime precision, and the courage to commit a vulnerable force for a decisive result. The lesson was not lost on them that a sneak attack on an anchored fleet, using carrier-borne aircraft, offered the maximum return on their strategic investment. This dramatic operational proof of concept provided the justification for a complete strategic overhaul across all major world navies. Naval architects now had to contend with the immediate and critical necessity of improving anti-aircraft defense and the protective measures against the devastating aerial torpedo. The Taranto raid was not merely a tactical victory, It was an intellectual and doctrinal victory for the proponents of naval air power over the traditionalist forces of the old Naval Guard. It was the first undeniable sign that a new age of naval dominance had begun, an age where the aircraft carrier ruled the waves from the skies above. The German Navy's sole attempt at an aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, became a haunting monument to the lessons of Taranto that were learned too late and too slowly. The ship, still uncompleted and rusting in its dry dock, became a painful symbol of the Kriegsmarine's fundamental failure of strategic priorities and execution. Following the crippling success of the British raid, the project was briefly revived with a new, frantic sense of urgency and necessity. Admiral Raeder now understood the immediate, critical need for air cover over his surface raiders and a means to project German air power far into the Atlantic. However, the renewed effort was immediately hampered by the lack of specialized aircraft, which still had to be converted from existing Luftwaffe designs. The Luftwaffe's continued reluctance to commit resources and fully integrate its air units with the naval command further guaranteed the carrier's eventual failure. Furthermore, the materials and manpower required to complete such a massive vessel were desperately needed for the more immediate and higher priority U-boat building program. The German leadership, preoccupied with the grinding land war on the Eastern Front, consistently viewed the naval struggle as a secondary theater of operations. The repeated, frustrating delays and the continuous, low-level bureaucratic sabotage demonstrated the deep, lingering institutional resistance to the carrier concept. Hitler himself, often distracted and impatient with complex naval matters, eventually lost faith in the viability of the carrier project altogether. By 1943, with the war turning disastrously against Germany, all work on the Graf Zeppelin was officially and finally cancelled, and the ship was effectively scuttled. The massive, unfinished hull sat forlornly in the Baltic Sea, a silent, stark reminder of the strategic advantage that Germany had needlessly squandered. Had the German admirals embraced the carrier concept earlier and with full commitment, the strategic landscape of the Battle of the Atlantic might have been drastically different. A fully operational Graf Zeppelin could have provided crucial air reconnaissance and fighter protection for the Bismarck or other surface raiders, potentially altering their fates. The failure to complete the carrier was not a matter of engineering, it was a devastating result of doctrinal stubbornness and chronic, debilitating indecision at the top. The ghost of the Graf Zeppelin represents the massive, strategic opportunity cost of the German admirals' initial, dismissive laughter at the very idea of a carrier-led war at sea. The immediate strategic consequence of the Taranto raid extended far beyond the crippled Italian battleships and deeply into the entire Mediterranean theater of operations. The forced withdrawal of the remaining Italian capital ships to ports further north immediately reduced the pressure on the heavily besieged British base at Malta. Malta was a tiny but critically important island, acting as the single, essential choke point for Axis supply convoys heading from Europe to North Africa. With the threat of the Italian fleet dramatically curtailed, the Royal Navy was given the necessary freedom of movement to reinforce and resupply the vital island fortress. The British could now operate their own carrier strike groups with a significantly reduced risk of being engaged by a superior Italian surface force. This newfound air and sea dominance directly led to a massive increase in the interdiction of Axis supply lines, severely crippling Rommel's army in the North African campaign. The British aircraft carriers, and the planes they carried, became the ultimate strategic force multiplier in the entire region, controlling the sea by dominating the air. Carrier-borne aircraft conducted relentless attacks on Axis ports, shipping, and land-based airfields, choking off the flow of fuel, ammunition, and men. This successful projection of air power proved that the aircraft carrier was not just a theoretical weapon but an absolutely indispensable tool for sustained regional military power. The Italian fleet, though still technically powerful, was now forced into a state of perpetual caution, unwilling to venture out to sea and face the devastating reach of the British carriers. The memory of the Taranto attack hung heavy in the Italian Admiralty, creating a profound reluctance to engage in open, full-scale naval combat. The lack of effective, integrated air cover for their own ships meant that the Italian fleet was perpetually operating at a severe and often fatal disadvantage. This strategic paralysis of the Italian surface fleet became one of the key factors that ultimately ensured the defeat of the Axis powers in the entire North African campaign. The Battle of Taranto was, therefore, not just a naval skirmish, it was the essential, enabling precursor to a massive, decisive land-based military victory. It showed the world that a handful of biplanes launched from a single carrier could effectively neutralize the power of an entire fleet and change the course of a massive theater of war. Despite the undeniable, powerful lessons of Taranto and the profound strategic implications in the Mediterranean, the German High Command remained stubbornly focused on land warfare. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, consumed the vast majority of Germany's military resources, attention, and strategic planning capacity. The immense, grinding scale of the Eastern Front War made naval matters, and particularly the abstract concept of naval air power, seem increasingly distant and irrelevant. The Kriegsmarine, already operating as a secondary service, found its pleas for resources and a renewed focus on its capital ship program consistently sidelined. The critical lesson that air power was the future of naval engagement was intellectually understood but practically ignored in the brutal, immediate calculus of the war effort. The focus on U-boat production as the primary means of fighting the Battle of the Atlantic further solidified the German Navy's inability to adapt to the carrier era. While U-boats proved devastatingly effective for a time, they still lacked the capacity to engage and defeat the growing, powerful Allied carrier groups directly. The German admirals, still clinging to their old doctrinal preference, continued to view their heavy surface ships as the main threat to British seaborne commerce. This strategy led to the deployment of ships like the Tirpitz, which became a notorious fleet in being, a massive deterrent that was ultimately useless without air cover. The battleship was constantly vulnerable to the very carrier-borne air strikes it was intended to counter, forcing it to hide in the Norwegian fjords for much of the war. The successful sinking of the Bismarck in 1941 by a coordinated air and sea attack further underscored the carrier's devastating, long-range killing power. Yet, even after these losses, the German commitment to naval air power remained pitifully small and fatally fragmented between the Navy and the all-powerful Luftwaffe. They failed to understand that the carrier's true value was not merely a tactical weapon but a strategic tool that defined the entire operational environment. The German admirals, despite the undeniable proof of Taranto, never truly committed to the expensive, complex, and politically difficult process of building a carrier fleet. This long-term strategic negligence became a permanent, crippling handicap that prevented the Kriegsmarine from ever seriously challenging the Allied mastery of the sea. The Battle of Taranto was, in a profound historical sense, a strategic and conceptual earthquake that shook the foundations of every major navy across the globe. It served as the definitive, bloody proof of concept for the future of naval warfare, effectively ending the century-long reign of the majestic, slow-moving battleship. The true significance of Taranto was not fully appreciated until the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which followed just over a year later, on December 7, 1941. The Japanese assault, meticulously planned using the lessons and blueprint of the British raid, was a massive, full-scale confirmation of the carrier's devastating potential. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated what a truly committed, large-scale carrier strike force could achieve when focused on a single, strategic objective. From that point onward, the aircraft carrier became the undisputed queen of the world's oceans, the central, indispensable asset of any global naval power. The great naval battles of the Pacific, from Midway to the Coral Sea, were fought entirely by aircraft, with the surface ships often never sighting one another. The outcomes of these battles were determined by the efficiency of the flight deck crews, the skill of the pilots, and the number of aircraft that could be launched and recovered. The United States, having witnessed both Taranto and Pearl Harbor, launched a massive, unprecedented carrier construction program that decisively won them the war in the Pacific. The battleship, though still serving with distinction, was permanently relegated to the subsidiary roles of shore bombardment and anti-aircraft escort for the vital carriers. Even today, in the 21st century, the aircraft carrier remains the ultimate symbol and tool of global military power projection for the world's leading navies. Massive nuclear-powered carriers, operating at the core of powerful task forces, continue the legacy of the small, intrepid biplanes that flew over Taranto decades ago. The German admirals' laughter at the perceived fragility of the carrier was ultimately silenced by the sound of exploding torpedoes and the smoke rising over the Italian harbor. Taranto was the moment when the future arrived, a brutal, undeniable lesson that marked the beginning of a new, aerial-dominated era of naval history that continues to this very day.